Okay. Welcome everyone to Pathways Through the Orchard. We are beginning a new book tonight, Vayikra, Leviticus. And I think everyone knows at this point that Pathways Through the Orchard is the third in the series. There's Orchard of Delights, and the second is Fruits of the Orchard. And now we are doing Pathways Through the Orchard. The common theme here is the word orchard. And this comes, just as a review, this comes from the idea of pardes, that every verse in the Torah, every mitzvah, every story can be understood according to four levels called pardes. Pshat, the literal meaning, the storyline. Remez, the alluded to meaning. Drush, the allegorical, metaphorical, symbolic meaning. And Sod, the mystical, spiritual, Kabbalistic meaning. Those are the four letters of Pardes. And all three of these series are based on this. Usually we don't necessarily differentiate and say, now this is the Pshat, now this is the Remez, now this is the Drush, now this is the Sod. In Orchard of Delights and Fruit of the Orchard, on occasion, I would make it very, very clear like that. And that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to do three different ideas in the parsha of Vayikra, the book of Vayikra, according to Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod, on three different subjects in our parsha. So we're going to begin with the first word of Leviticus is Vayikra, which means, and he called. The whole verse is Vayikra el Moshe, v'yadaber Hashem elav me'oel moed lemor. And he called to Moshe, and God spoke to him from the tent of testimony, the Mishkan, saying. That's how the book begins. And then the entire parsha is about the different offerings that were part of the service that happened in the Mishkan and later in the temple. And then later, all of that was translated into or reframed into the prayer services that we have today. That subject we have dealt with in the other two orchard, how each part of the current prayer services is a reflection of the offerings as described here. It's very, very important to understand that. So in the first word, Vayikra, there is a small letter Aleph. And anyone in a printed Chumash or looking in the actual Torah scroll can see that the Aleph of Vayikra, the last letter, is a small Aleph. In Orchard of Delights, I delved very deeply into the meaning of the small Aleph, but I didn't arrange it according to Pardes. And that's what I want to do right now, is there are many, many different explanations of why the Aleph in Vayikra is small. And so the first one, which is, we're going to call it the Pshat, the more literal understanding, is that when God called to Moshe, so we know that in a certain way, we can describe Moshe as being God's scribe. Moshe eventually wrote down the Torah according to how it was dictated to him by God. And so when God dictated, this is the explanation we have in the oral tradition, when God dictated to him that the Aleph of Vayikra, wait one second, give me a second. Oh, okay. When God called to him, so Moshe was the most humble person on the face of the earth. The Torah testifies to that. And so Moshe wanted to leave out the Aleph and wanted God to write it Vayikar. Vayikar means God just called out to Moshe just by happenstance. And Rashi explains, because the word Vayikra is used in our prayers in the angelic realms, that the angels call out one to the other in order to praise God. And the word Vayikra, Rashi explains, is an expression of endearment, of love. And so Moshe, who is so humble, when it says Vayikra el Moshe, so it was like raising Moshe up to the level of the angels. And Moshe preferred not to be like singled out for glory so much. So he wanted God to write Vayikar, that God happened to call to Moshe. God said, no, I'm calling to you out of great love. And we'll explain that a little bit more. But they came to a compromise. And the compromise is it would say Vayikra, but the Aleph would be small, and that would indicate Moshe's humbleness and almost discomfort at being called in such a loving way by God. That's what's brought as we'll call it the simple understanding of why this Aleph is small, is that it indicates Moshe's humbleness. So that's what's called the parshat, the literal storyline of how we understand the small letter. As we know, there are relatively very few small or big letters in the Chumash. So when a letter is big or small, there's always an important teaching. So that's the first level. What about the remez? So it actually says in the Gemara that anywhere that you will find God's greatness, there you will find his humbleness. So this is a bit of a startling statement, because God is all-powerful, all-knowing, infinite, and is the creator, and everything is dependent on God. So to talk about God as being humble, we have to like wrap our brain around that. But that's the statement of the sages, that every place that you'll find God's greatness, you will find his humbleness. So here we have to go back. How does the book of Shemot end? The book of Shemot ends that after 7 days of putting up and taking down the Mishkan, on the 8th day, which was Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the Mishkan was erected and was left standing, and the service of the Mishkan was set to begin. And the book of Shemot ends that Moshe is standing outside the Mishkan, and it says he could not go in because the glory of God filled the entire Mishkan. As it were, there was no space for Moshe to enter. It was full of the presence of the Shekhinah. And that's where Vayikra begins, that God called to him from the Ohel Moed and begins to explain the service. And it's understood that it's not that he was just calling him, but he was calling him to enter into the service that would be performed in the Mishkan. Because God spoke to Moshe, and then Moshe explained it to Aharon and the other Kohanim and the Levim and to the people. So on the level of remez, as a hint, the book of Shemot ends with God's greatness. He filled the Mishkan. There was no room for a human being. And so the Aleph represents here God's humbleness. So first we had Moshe's humbleness to explain the small Aleph. But here we have God's humbleness as expressed in the small Aleph, because now God was making room for Moshe and Am Yisrael to enter into the Mishkan, even though God's presence filled the Mishkan. God contracted his essence in order to make space. And so that brings us to the drasha. Rosh Chodesh Nisan, according to tradition, is the actual day that God created the world. In Tractate Rosh Hashanah, there's an in-depth discussion as to when did God create the world. And the two versions or the two views was on Rosh Hashanah, which most of us associate for sure with the creation of the world, and Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And in the discussion in the Gemara, it goes back and forth and brings different proofs that the world was either created in the first of Tishrei or the first of Nisan. Well, the first of Nisan is the very day that we're talking about here. That's when Vayikra begins, on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Again, in Orchard of Delights, this is written about extensively. I invite everyone to review it. And so here on the level of drasha, the allegory, the symbolism, the deeper metaphoric meaning is the small aleph represents tzimtzum, contraction. Just like God here contracts his infinite being, first of all, to even be in the Mishkan. But now, at the end of the book of Shemot, the Mishkan was full of the glory of God. There was no room. But here, the small aleph represents God further contracting his infinite being so all of Israel could come into the Mishkan and the service could begin. And of course, we know that this idea of Tzimtzum is connected to the creation of the world, as the Arizal explains, that before time and space, world and creation, there was only the infinity of God. And God contracted, as it were, his infinite being in order to make space for a finite world. And so this is something that we've mentioned many times already, is that the Mishkan is considered a microcosm of the macrocosm. The macrocosm is the creation, as all the entire universe is symbolized in the different elements and materials and details and numbers and colors of the Mishkan. And so here, on the level of drasha, the small aleph represents God contracting his infinite being in order to be perceived in this world altogether, but all the more so in a small space called the Mishkan, or the temple. So that is the secret of the small aleph on the level of the creation. And here on the level of Sod, the secret understanding, the mystical understanding of the Mishkan is, as we said, it is the microcosm of the macrocosm. It reminds me of a famous story of the Kotzker Rebbe. The Kotzker Rebbe was 5 years old, and he was already known as being a genius. But and one of the rabbis, again, he's like 5 years old, he's like a little kid. And so one of the rabbis kind of wanted to test him. And he said, "Where can you find God?" And the Kotzker Rebbe said, "Anywhere that you let him in. That's where you'll find God." And if you remember, we've discussed this, that the ultimate purpose of building a holy place for God is a deeper level than a physical mishkan or temple or synagogue, is that our hearts and souls and minds should be the place where God can appear to us and can fill our being, just like God filled the Mishkan in prayer and in study and in good deeds and meditation and contemplation. We make a place where the infinite God can interact with us on a personal level. So that is the Sod. The Sod is that the Mishkan is the microcosm of the macrocosm. But the human soul is a further microcosm of the Mishkan. So hopefully everyone followed that, because it's a very important development, that from all of creation, it is represented in the Mishkan. But the Mishkan ultimately is meant to be represented within us. That is the expression sometimes when you see a Talmid Chacham, a Torah scholar. So sometimes they're referred to as a walking Sefer Torah. They embody the entire Torah. So that is our first pardes. We went through the small aleph, how it goes from Moshe's humbleness to God's humbleness, to the idea of God contracting his infinite being to allow a creation to occur. And then God further contracts his infinite being to appear in the Mishkan, and even deeper, to appear within the soul. So that's our first pardes. The next pardes is we're going to look at the simple translation of Vayikra, and he called. The whole book is named after this one word, Vayikra. And so on the level of the pshat, so we already actually explained this. The book of Shemot ends with Moshe standing outside with the glory of God filling the Mishkan, and Moshe feeling there's no place for him to go in. It is full of the glory of God. And so here, God calls to Moshe to draw him closer. And that's why Rashi says that this word is a expression of endearment. And so God is encouraging Moshe, there is a place for you. That's the simple of an understanding of his calling. And that's why, again, it says, and he called to Moshe, and God spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, and then God begins to explain to him the service through the offerings. That will be our third parshat that we'll get to. So that's the first simple understanding of he called. Then Rashi explains that when it says Vayikra el Moshe, and he spoke to him from the tent of meeting, from the Mishkan. So Rashi wants to make sure that we understand that only Moshe heard this calling. And that's why it says Vayikra el Moshe. But that's alluded to. It's alluded to because we would think if a voice went out, then everyone would hear it. But Rashi makes a point of clarifying that only Moshe heard this voice. And so this points out the special level that Moshe was on. As the Torah, close to the last words of the Torah says, a prophet like Moshe has never arisen again. Moshe is in a category of his own. So here we see that God is calling to Moshe, and as it were, no one else hears it. No one else hears it. And yet, the drasha that so many of the Hasidic Rebbe's say is, even though Rashi points out that only Moshe heard this voice, the call, Hashem calling out to Moshe, is a call to all of Am Yisrael. Moshe can't do the service in the temple by himself. It was the Kohanim and the Levim who did the service. And the parsha continues by explaining how each and every person had the ability to, and sometimes the obligation, to bring an offering. The whole rest of the parsha is about the offerings. And I see that Nahum, I usually can't always relate to the chats as they come in. It's too much. But he points out that today is Zayin Adar. This is Moshe Rabbeinu's birthday and the day that he left this world. Zayin Adar. And it's also a big day because my youngest grandson was born on Zayin Adar, and he's 4 years old today. Raziel Sapir Ben Aiden Daniel and Chana Shira Bat Yamina. So happy birthday, Raziel. So on the level of drush, even though God is calling to Moshe, it's really a call to everyone. And how can we understand this? This is according to the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe, in a sense, followed in the footsteps of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov said there's a spark of Mashiach that everyone has. The Alter Rebbe said that there's also a spark of Moshe. Everyone has a spark of Moshe. So if God is calling to Moshe, he's in a sense calling to everyone, because everyone has a point of Moshe. And the Alter Rebbe pointed, what is this point of motion, everyone? It's the seichel. It's the intellect. It's the chachma, bina, and dat. That is the point of Moshe within each person. So here we see that we're all being called into the service of God. And this is very important because, as we said before, the temple doesn't exist anymore. The whole service that we're going to be reading about in the book of Vayikra doesn't exist anymore. So the natural question is, if the Torah is eternal, what are we supposed to learn from all of these offerings? And they're in great detail. And as we said before, and again, I encourage everyone to look back in Orchard of Delights and Fruits of the Orchard, in this parsha and the next week's parsha, to read about, I think it's in Orchard of Delights, how the different offerings that we're going to be reading about in the next two parshas were translated by the sages into the different parts of our daily prayers. I'm not going to go back into it right now, but all of the offerings are eternal. It's just that we don't do them with animals anymore. We do it through prayer. But the type of offerings are the different parts of the prayer services. And like I said, that's a subject in of itself. But the idea here is that God is calling all of us into the service of God. Now that we don't have a temple, each and every person becomes like the Kohen Gadol and the other Kohanim and the Leviim that are doing the service. Each and every person becomes responsible. At the time of the temple, it was before there were what we call synagogues. The service was done in the temple for all of Israel. It was a communal service, all taking place in one place. And then, towards the end of the second temple, already the institution of the synagogue began. And today, it quite literally replaces the temple. And also, as we made clear in Orchard of Delights, the different parts of the synagogue are also different parts that existed in the temple. Now on the level of sod, and this is a little bit like a play on words. In English, there's this expression that someone finds their calling in life. This idea of a calling. Well, that is the first word of this book, Vayikra. And God called to Moshe. So on the level of sod, what we can learn here is God is calling each and every person. And sometimes we hear, sometimes we don't hear. And the question is asked, does God still speak to human beings? We open up the Chumash, we open up the Tanakh, and we see God speaking to people all the time. Question is God still speaking to us? And if so, how is God speaking to us? And so each and every person is, of course, different. But as a general statement, we can say God speaks to us through the circumstances of our lives. The way that our lives play themselves out is the way that God is speaking to us. We have free will. We're making decisions. We are deciding this, that, and the other thing. But while that is happening, there's always a divine direction to each and every one of our lives, to every planet, every star, every atom, every galaxy. There is a directing force. And so this expression, to find one's calling, means to find one's purpose in life, find one's mission in life. And the idea of calling is that, again, it doesn't mean that we hear God speaking to us in an actual voice, but I'm sure everyone here has had the experience of feeling God speaking to them. And many times it's through the way our life is playing itself out. That's how God is speaking to us. And in Fruits of the Orchard, I point out that this word Vayikra, this is not the only place that it appears in the Chumash. And in many cases, it's human beings calling out to God, or designating, calling something through deep understanding. And the most important example is that Abraham calls to God with the same word, Vayikra. He called in the name of God. And so in Fruits of the Orchard, I explain, the more we call out to God, the more God calls out to us. That is we'll call it the secret, the magic of prayer. Prayer is our direct connection with God. Remember, the letters of Yisrael is Yeshar Kel, straight to God. Everyone has a direct line to God. And the more we call out to God, the more God calls out to us. And we know that when Eliyahu Navi escaped to the Sinai for his life, the king and the queen wanted to kill him, and they had succeeded in killing almost all of the prophets. And Eliyahu flees to the Sinai desert. And there, God speaks to him with Kol D'mama Daka, a thin, silent voice. And that's the voice that we still hear. We hear God's voice in our own minds, in our soul, in our hearts. And it's a silent voice, but sometimes it's booming. Sometimes we get messages very clear what God is trying to tell us. Other times it's not clear at all. But God is calling out to us, and we are calling out to God. And prayer is the way. And we know that the sages said that prayer has replaced the offerings. And so, of course, there's only so much we can learn in the evening. But when you go through this parsha, I have to say, many people, I'll just use the term, are turned off when they read these parshas, because it's about a service that we is so distant from us. But that's only because people have not learned how to translate it into our lives and make it relevant. And so, again, that's what I attempted in Orchard of Delights, to really try to explain in detail how the synagogue, the Beit Knesset, and our prayers are directly learned from these parshas. And here we're learning about animal sacrifices. And again, many people have like a hard time relating to it. And it's only because they're lacking the proper oral tradition to know how to translate it into current reality. So that is pardes on the level of calling. We'll do it again. First, God calls just to Moshe. That's the simple pshat. The remez is that only Moshe heard. The drasha is really, it's a calling for everyone. And the sod is this idea how God is still speaking to us in this call d'mama daka, in a small, silent voice. So that is our second pardes of the night. The last one we're going to do is about the offerings, the animal sacrifices. So the simple pshat is exactly what we read in the time of the Mishkan, in the time of the temple. Now we're talking about from the time of the Mishkan to the time of the destruction of the temple is approximately 1,400 years. 1,400 years. That's almost 5 times the history of the United States. And we were offering animal sacrifices. That's the simple meaning. That was the way that we connected to God. That's the way that the service was done by the Kohanim in the name of all of Israel. And because many of these sacrifices were brought by individuals for different reasons. And as we go through the book of Vayikra, hopefully we'll be able to get a little bit deeper into some of these different offerings. So that's the simple meaning. On the level of remez, so we look at the word for sacrifice in the Torah, and it's karban. And everyone points out that the root of karban, which means sacrifice, is lekarev, to come close. And so here, it's a beautiful allusion to the purpose of the sacrifices. It's a way to get close to God. And the following statement is very, very important, that anyone who learns history and learns anthropology knows that in order to properly understand human history, to properly understand human society, culture, development, has to know that we can't judge the past by today's standards. If you do that, you miss everything. You miss everything. In other words, today we have certain standards, certain cultural agreements, certain ways that society goes about things, certain understandings within each religion, each culture. But these change over time. And so to judge past customs or laws by the way we do things today, we miss the whole thing. And this is a big mistake that people make, because people look at the animal offerings and say, I can't relate to it. I'm not interested. This is barbaric. This is horrible. but that's judging by a standard that we have today. And it does a disservice to understanding how peoples and society have developed. One of the greatest ways to see this is National Geographic. National Geographic, I had a subscription for decades. And every issue is talking about a different people in a different time and their laws and culture and habits and ways of relating to each other, relating to God. And they do it with great respect. They don't judge by today's standards. It's every culture has their symbolic meanings that are important to them, that are built into their cultural system. So I'm saying all of this because when we learn about the service in the temple, so we have to understand from, in a sense, their worldview, not by ours today. But as I said, the most important thing is everything that we're learning in this parsha, which animals and how they were slaughtered, how they were brought to the altar, who ate them. All of these details actually apply to the way we daven today. And on a deeper level, they relate to the human psyche. And it's really quite deep, as we're going to see in a minute. So that's the level of remez, that in those days, that is how people, not just in Israel, came close to God, is by bringing offerings. So on the level of drush, and I'm thinking specifically, I just want to see if he's here tonight. 1 second. I don't see him here right now. I could be wrong. Yeah, he is here. David. So David is in our discussions is always talking about self-sacrifice. That's a theme that David brings up all the time. And this is connected to the drasha of understanding these offerings. Because when we would bring an offering, it's not only that we were bringing something that we felt would bring us close to God. And we have to understand the experience of being in the temple and the Mishkan was an absolutely awesome experience. We really have a hard time understanding. First of all, in the Mishkan in the first temple, the presence of God was palpable. And the glory of the physical building. And I think everyone knows that when you go into a beautiful space, it affects you. Just as an aside, and maybe I'll be able to share with the WhatsApp, I had thought of it. On Friday, my wife and I went to the new National Museum in Israel. Library, excuse me. Thank you, Rachel. Not museum, library. They were building it for years. It's literally across from the Knesset. It is this incredibly beautifully made building, and the inside, it's in circles. The library on 3 different floors, and when you go in there, I felt I was in a holy space. Now we have to understand that probably half the books in the library, they have 4.5 million books. Only a small number are actually on display, and the rest you can, there are computers everywhere. You can look up what book you want, and if it's not on the shelves, they'll bring it up from the lower levels. But I'm just mentioning that because going into the temple, the Mishkan, was an absolute awesome experience. The way the Kohanim were dressed, and the music, and the incense, and the offerings, and the fire. It was just overwhelming. Most people have had at least once a very deep spiritual experience at the Kotel. Can't say that every time we go to the Kotel, the Wailing Wall, we have this life-changing experience. But most people, at one time or another, do have some very, very deep experiences at the Kotel. But the Kotel was not even part of the temple. It was actually just a retaining wall for the Temple Mount on which the temple stood. So it's what's called kal v'chomer. If one has an experience by the retaining wall of the Temple Mount, how much more so would it be to be inside the temple? And so on the level of drasha, this is the idea of sacrifice. The offerings were called sacrifices. It was a financial sacrifice to bring an offering. An animal costs money. And actually in this parsha, they have what are called the mincha offerings. The mincha offerings were flour offerings. And who brought the flour offerings? People who are poor, who could not afford to bring it. But there it says nefesh, a soul that brings a flour offering. So Rashi says, why does it use a name for the soul? And Rashi explains, because for a poor person, even bringing some flour, it means it's like they're giving their soul. And so this is one of the deep meanings of the offerings, is not only are we sacrificing financially, but the animal became a replacement for ourselves, especially with what are called the sin offerings. Everyone knows the weight of guilt and shame at different times in our lives. When we do something wrong, and we know that it was wrong, and we hurt ourselves, we hurt other people, we hurt God, it's a big burden having guilt and shame. And the offerings were a way to fix that, to nullify the feeling of guilt and shame. And that's why they were called guilt offerings. And so this idea of, again, we're on the drasha, that the karban means to come close. But we're coming close by not only sacrificing, but self-sacrifice, where the animal becomes a replacement for us. So that, of course, is a very deep subject in itself. And the level of sod, so there's a statement in the Zohar that says that the secret of the karban rises up to a tika kadisha, the highest level in Keter. So what was the Zohar trying to tell us? So we might think that the sacrifice was like an easy way to get rid of our guilt and sin. And the Zohar is trying to make clear that the process, we have to understand that you can't bring a sin offering without doing tshuva. It doesn't work. A person has to do tshuva, and the sin offering is like the final step, the final clarification and cleansing of the process of tshuva. And so the idea is that the animal takes the place of our own culpability. And therefore, the Zohar says that the secret of the karban goes to the highest place, because a person can go through the motions of doing tshuva, but if it doesn't get to the heart and the mind and the soul, then a person carries that weight constantly. In other words, we could bring a animal sacrifice, and we could, do the whole ritual. But if we didn't do the tshuva, then not only does it not work, but the prophets later came and railed against the whole sacrificial service, because they felt that the people had lost the understanding of the process. And some say that's even on a deep, deep level, the actual reason why the temple was destroyed is that the whole service had become corrupted. It had lost its inner meaning, and it became almost inevitable that it would have to pass away, so that a different type of service, which we now call prayer, could take its place. So that's the level of sod, is that the process of bringing the karban, bringing the offering, truly cleansed oneself. And that today we have the process of tshuva. But again, we have to understand, bringing a karban was dramatic. It was a dramatic experience. And that's why I started the discussion, is that we don't understand that today. And so to read this parsha and look back and say, oh, that's like so backwards, it's so barbaric, totally misses the point. Totally doesn't get that in that time framework, it worked. And when it stopped working, the temple was no longer. In other words, the temple could not, in a sense, stomach the service that had been emptied from its inner meaning. So again, we'll review now the pardes of the karbanot. The simple understanding is that's just how they did it in those days. The remez is that the karban means to come close. The root of the word karban means to come close. Today, it's used in what's called kiruv, this idea of reaching out to people and bringing them closer to the Torah. That's the word that's used. Kiruv comes from the same thing as karban. And the drasha is this idea of sacrifice, the idea of the animal coming to replace them, and not just the animal. It could have been a flower offering, comes to play out a person's tshuva process. And the process of tshuva entails a certain amount of sacrifice. To be honest, to daven 3 times a day, to pray 3 times a day is a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice of time. It's a sacrifice of effort. It's a sacrifice of focus. But we believe that it works. But it's the same thing as the temple. If we just go through the motions, because that's what we're supposed to do, that's what a good Jew does. They daven 3 times a day. But if it's empty of what we call kavana, if it's empty of the basic of idea that I'm praying in order to come close to God, that's it. And if it doesn't have that basis, then at a certain point it becomes empty. It becomes an empty shell. And then on the level of sod, we see that this process of the service that we're talking about, whether it's the service in the temple or the service in the Beit Knesset, or it's the service of the heart and the mind and the soul, rises up to a tika, rises up to the highest level of soul, because the only way to do tshuva, for it to work, is for it to be for real. And in those days, the animal sacrifice or the flower sacrifice made it very real, made it very, very real. Okay, we went through 3 different orchards tonight, 3 different pardeses. And like I said, most of the time, I don't stop and do it in a methodolic, how do you say, methodolic, however you say that word. What is it, Rachel? Methodical. What would I do without Rachel? I don't go through it in a methodical way, but the whole orchard series is based on the idea of seeing in every word, every verse, every story, every mitzvah, these 4 levels: pshat, remez, drush, and sod. May we all be graced with the inspiration to look at the Torah through the lens of the Pardes.